Hey everybody, welcome to Mossback, the official podcast of the Mossback's Northwest video series from Cascade PBS. I'm Stephen Hegg.
And I'm Knut Berger.
And I'm Allison Mariella Désir.
And today we're talking about the great outdoors and the ways that racism has limited access to it. And for this conversation, we're teaming up with Allison, host of the Cascade PBS video series Out and Back, a show about Black, Indigenous, and other people of color who are reclaiming space in the outdoors.
I want to see more people who look like us having more varied outdoor experiences in a skilled way.
Now, a couple of seasons ago, an episode of Mossback's Northwest told the story of Catherine Montgomery, a white woman known as the mother of the Pacific Crest Trail.
I would like to highlight a school teacher whose love of hiking in the wilds inspired a famous trail.
But it turns out she also expressed racist views. This revelation demands a deeper conversation about the way history gets told and how celebrated historical figures can often be complex, contradictory, and problematic too. Now, if you haven't seen the video, take a few moments to watch it. It will provide some more context for this conversation. You can find the video in the show notes, but for now, let's unpack some of this history with Allison. Knut, let's take a step back. Who was Catherine Montgomery?
Catherine Montgomery was a pretty remarkable woman. She was a teacher at what is now Western Washington University back in the early 20th century when it was a teacher's college. And she was an avid outdoors woman, a member of the Mountaineers and other climbing groups. She was very active in some what were then considered progressive women's clubs that had a lot of writers and progressive women who were politically involved and hoping to improve the world. And she was also involved in a very early environmental effort, which was to preserve old-growth forest. And, of course, this is in the era when the logging companies are, chopping everything down. And one remarkable thing that was sort of uncovered not long ago was that she was the one who sparked the idea for the Pacific Crest Trail. She had read and seen about the Appalachian Trail and thought, why don't we have a Mexico to Canada trail through our mountains? And she was one of the very first to broach that idea. So she's called by some the mother of the Pacific Crest Trail. So she's just a very interesting figure in Northwest history, but not one who's really well known.
Mm-hmm. Why are we revisiting Catherine Montgomery?
So a few years ago, we started a feature in Mossback's Northwest called Upon Further Review. And so we do 1 or 2 episodes a year where we look at what we've learned since an episode ran. And one of the things that came back when our piece on Montgomery was Ron Jund, who's a longtime local journalist based up in Bellingham. He went to college there, got his degree, and he had done a thesis about politics at the school back in the era that we're talking about. And in the course of that, he came across an account of a professor there who had heard Catherine Montgomery make some very racist remarks at a public meeting. She used the N-word and appeared to be defending lynching. So pretty extreme. And so he wrote me and said, hey, here's a piece of the story that you should know about. And that's exactly the kind of thing that I thought, well, this is important to talk about. This is something, the kind of thing we like to explore in our video series. And I thought, well, Allison would be a great person to bring into this conversation because her program, Out and Back, is devoted to kind of rectifying the problem that so much of the outdoors movement has been a white affair. I guess I can say that.
Right.
There's been exclusion and outright genocide involved in the wilderness movement, the conservation movement, the outdoor recreation movement. And that's something that we need to know more about because many of us grow up and don't know about it.
Allison, had you heard of Catherine Montgomery before?
I had not heard of Catherine Montgomery, but the story of people who are our quote-unquote heroes being problematic is a story that is not new to me.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Honestly, the history of this country is one that's rooted in genocide and white supremacy. And so when we look back at historical figures, we can hold space for some of the incredible accomplishments that they had, while also understanding that they were very much figures of their time. They have done some good, and they also have ideas about people and the world that are problematic and harmful.
Knut, did you find anything more out about Catherine Montgomery than what Ron Judd had alluded to?
No, not really. I mean, but what it sparked was looking at the context of the early outdoor movement. And, we're talking about, again, at the late 19th century, early 20th century, you have the Mountaineers is founded, the Mazamas, which were the Mountaineers of Oregon. They're hiking all over the place. And they're including women in that, women married and single going out with men into the outdoors. There was an early mountaineers hike into a very little explored area of what's now Olympic National Park. And I found a funny thing saying, a count of noses in the Mountaineers party revealed 21 of the gentler sex. And it may be observed in passing that the cultivation of a love of athletics and adventure, which necessarily fosters a love of the beautiful in the minds and habits of girls and women, is one of the triumphs of our present civilization.
Oh, my.
So just being a woman in the outdoors, you were, regarded as, advancing women's rights and women's causes.
But at the time, and sometimes today, when we're talking about women, we're most often talking about white women. Mm-hmm. And it's particularly unnerving to me to understand that white women during that time were both victims of oppression and perpetrators of oppression, right? The time of the Mountaineers and the Mazamas, you think about the women's suffrage movement that was happening at the same time. And of course, we know that white women earned the right to vote during that time, but black women, it wasn't until the civil rights movement, right? So this idea of interlocking oppression, of intersectionality, is one that requires us to really look deeply into this history. What women are we talking about here? Who's being prioritized? Who's being oppressed?
Well, it brings to mind the progressive movement of the age, Teddy Roosevelt and others, and how their legacy is so mixed. I look at Teddy Roosevelt as a very inspiring figure in many, many ways, but, I'm also well aware of
hugely problematic.
Yes, that he had some very problematic views. What were some of those ideas? What were some of those beliefs?
In sum, Teddy Roosevelt really believed that the land was for white men. Right. So despite indigenous people being on the land and being there from time immemorial, Teddy Roosevelt's project and others like him were really about creating wilderness for white men like himself. Right. And there are some awful quotes. I'll read one right now that just speak to really his ideas about who belonged in these spaces. This is in 1886. Teddy Roosevelt said, "I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indian is the dead Indian. But I believe 9 out of every 10 are, and I shouldn't like to inquire too closely in the case of the 10th. The most vicious cowboy has more moral principle than the average Indian." Right? So this idea of land was really for white people, for, if you think about what was it?
Sort of the manifest destiny.
There you go. That is it. I had to go back to ninth grade history.
Not of the nation, but of a race.
Right. This idea that whiteness is the norm, that white people deserve to be in power, that all of this sort of this divine right to come in and conquer and save the land from these no good indigenous black and brown folks who are wild and savage, right? And that is the undercurrent for the work of Teddy Roosevelt, the work of John Muir. And I will say, even for myself, it's sort of devastating when you find out the truth of history. And it's the work, I think, of history to do a better job of relaying the complexity of figures.
What about John Muir, who's the high priest of the outdoors historically?
Yes, of the religion I was brought up in. John Muir was born in Scotland, came over to the United States as a young man, and he became, through his writing and lecturing and, became this proselytizer of the importance of the wilderness, the importance of nature, and preserving it with parks so that people could enjoy it into the future. And he tended to view nature as very unspoiled, which, didn't necessarily account for the experience of indigenous people, both having cultivated so-called wild areas, but also having been forcibly excluded from them. And so, he's become sort of the patron saint. He founded the Sierra Club. He became the patron saint. And his attitudes about race, about black people, about indigenous people have been controversial as they have been revealed by historians or re-looking at the history and finding things, the same way people found that Catherine Montgomery wasn't progressive in the modern sense. Muir had some flaws in this area, too.
He founded the Sierra Club 128 years ago. Today, they issued a statement saying they're going to re-examine our substantial role in perpetuating white supremacy. They cited Muir's friendships with people who believed in eugenics and said he made derogatory comments about black people and indigenous people that drew on deeply harmful racist stereotypes.
This history, I can speak from a personal standpoint, has literally been whitewashed. Okay, I went to John Muir Elementary School here in Seattle. The U.S. Post Office came out with a John Muir stamp, and we all, as a class project, sent in for a first day postcard showing John Muir and as literally a saint. And the school was founded to foster John Muir's beliefs in preserving the wilderness. The old school has been torn down. It's still called John Muir. Interestingly, the student body is almost entirely people of color. When I was there, it was less so. But they still have these giant sequoias that were planted there, kind of in honor of John Muir's ideals. My mother and family were loved hiking, camping, national parks. And these things were, I was taught that they were sacred. It was literally like a secular church.
Yes, it's a spirituality. I felt that very, very much as a child, gallivanting around the outdoors with my family.
And if I could interject, the idea of being in the outdoors at certain points in my life was terrifying, right? The idea of what happens to you when you go into the dark, into the forest. I think of being around trees and what that could signify. I think of what is the famous song of Strange Fruit, right? The idea of seeing black men being lynched, right? So, and as a young child, my mother never wanted me to go out past a certain time or to go past certain geographical limits. This idea of wandering freely in the outdoors, and that's a space of serenity, it very much was constructed for me as a space of potential violence and a place that you should be careful of.
And I think still remember that as hard as it may be for me to imagine, because I'm a white man, these legacies are generational.
Absolutely.
You don't leave all of that behind. They do live on. There's a legacy of it.
Absolutely. You can look right now at the national parks, and I forget the exact statistics, but statistics show that black and brown people are the least likely to visit national parks, right? So all of this historical trauma very much has an impact on who sees themselves in the outdoors, who feels safe, who feels accepted in the outdoors. And as demographics change in this country, right, people predict that by 2050, the United States white people will actually be the minority in this country. So who are then the stewards of the parks, right? If black and brown people are not visiting in high enough numbers, if we don't have this sense of safety and welcome in these spaces, then what does that mean for our national parks, right? There are very real implications that are rooted in these historical facts. And this is a place, again, where we sort of have to hold these conflicting feelings, right? On the one hand, the outdoors does pose a sense of risk to me because I wonder who's going to be out there. Is somebody going to help me if I'm injured? But on the other hand, I love the outdoors, right? My show is all about one, telling unknown stories, but also hopefully introducing more people of color to the outdoors, because it is a place where I have found a sense of freedom. I've realized that I'm far stronger physically, mentally than I ever thought before. But it's this, yes, and it's not either or.
Allison, I'd like to know some of the comments, some of the feelings that other people of color have expressed to you about going out into the outdoors, whatever that experience was, how deep it was or whatever. But what they expressed at first and if there was any transformation there.
Yeah, so there's obviously so many stories. But one thing I will say that's common in the Black community around activities that take place in the outdoors is Black people will say, you know what, that's white people stuff, right? And on the one hand, it's kind of a humorous way of getting at this idea that it is white people's stuff because historically it has been unsafe for us to do that, right? It's like shorthand for drawing to this historical fact that it's been unsafe or we haven't had the opportunity to do that. So for many people, a lot of activities in the outdoors feel like it's something that they can't do. But then on the other hand, which I think is hugely important, is that Black people have been in the outdoors doing incredible things for centuries, right? If you think about, for example, the Buffalo Soldiers, right? All Black troops that were some of the original stewards of national parks. While African Americans had fought in many military conflicts since colonial days, the Buffalo Soldiers, composed of former slaves, freemen, and Black Civil War soldiers, were the first to serve during peacetime. If you think about Black people coming from Africa and the way that they were caring for the land, right? When I learned later the true story of slavery, slaves were chosen based on their agricultural ability. Europeans didn't just go to Benin and parts of Africa and take any old body. They took the farmers, they took the people who knew how to cultivate land, and they brought them to this country. They kidnapped them and brought them to this country because they knew that they were good at this, right? So this is something that we've always been immersed in, but we have been disconnected from because of white supremacy, lack of resources, et cetera, that exist in this country.
It seems to me that there are so many reasons that people of color have not been able to or are uncomfortable going out into the outdoors, camping, hiking, and the like. Certainly overt racism. But the practical, the functional reasons, one of the things I think about is time. What are some of those other practical things that come into play here? Yeah,
as we know in this country, race is very much tied to socioeconomic status and opportunity. So in addition to needing time, you need resources, right? You need the funds to be able to spend on these activities. I am now 4 years into living in Washington, and man, the amount of things I have accumulated for this very cheap, quote unquote, access to the outdoors. I've got, all kinds of things.
But you need a car.
Yeah, most importantly, you need a car. And then you need access, right? Many Black people, people of color, live in cities. One, for money reasons. Two, for a sense of safety, right? Things that happen in rural areas. And so that means getting to these places is difficult. And I will say an additional piece that I've learned through doing my show is there's a lot of gatekeeping that takes place. There's a lot of, people want to, quote unquote, discover beautiful places and then not share them with other people. So I have finally gotten to a place where I feel like I'm on the inside circle of the quote unquote really good places, but that has taken several years for me to break in and now share with others.
I wonder if that's a form of the Seattle freeze. I know the cool places, the secret places, but I don't want anybody else to go there and ruin it for me. I'm struck by a sort of bro culture, that we have a huge amount of people tech people who have moved into the area, and all of a sudden bouldering and climbing clubs and hiking are very, very, very big. And it seems to be sort of faddish and still kind of exclusive in a way.
Absolutely exclusive. I mean, when I hear bro culture, I think of it as just another way of saying white supremacy culture. And so I would say, yes, absolutely. I mean, I do think that there are instances where the racism and sense of exclusion are overt, and there are other instances where it is more implied, right? For example, you can go to certain trails that will list the rules for the trails, and certain things will say, like, no loud music, no dancing, right? Like very restrictive things. And it makes me wonder, who are these rules for? Who gets to decide what the culture is in the outdoors? Shouldn't we all be part of making that decision? I also think that, well, what I know is what often happens to me is if I go someplace and I'm attempting something really difficult in the outdoors, white people will often look at me and say, is this your first time? And give me instruction on how to do the thing, as if I could never have possibly had that experience before, right? And so these are subtle microaggressions. I certainly don't think that the person asking me that, it has bad intent, but the impact of that is telling me, oh, you don't think I belong here. You don't see people like me here. And you think that you need to shepherd me down this path. But, these white supremacy culture is the culture that we live in. And so it's important to tell other stories. It's important to resist that narrative. Again, to remind people that while the history of the outdoors has been very whitewashed, we have been in these spaces. And I actually want to tell this story that I hope one day to tell on my show. But come to find out that one of the very first Black golf clubs in the country was founded right here in Seattle in 1947, right? And when I found that out, coming from New York, I was like, what? Like, things like that happen in Seattle? But that's incredible. You think about all of the obstacles that remain to get access to golfing, right? And for a group of Black people to gather together and say, we want to create opportunities and safety and start something despite all of the obstacles, to me is really incredible.
What's the name of the golf club, by the way?
First State Golf Club.
The First State.
Yeah. And I mentioned this briefly already, but the Buffalo Soldiers, there's actually a group that is committed to maintaining and sharing their legacy and teaching future Black youth about horseback riding.
Our organization, the Buffalo Soldiers of Seattle, we do parades, festivals, we go to schools, and we teach the history of the Buffalo Soldiers.
But that fact, that blew my mind. Just that there were all Black troops, that they were stewards of national parks, like that is not a story that I ever heard growing up, right? And that in and of itself contributes to why we're not in the outdoors. If all of our heroes are white people, if all of our heroes are white men, and we don't know that we've been there, then we feel like maybe we don't belong there. Maybe it's not for us.
That reminds me of a point that was made. We made a documentary last year about the photographs of Aishel Curtis, and the Washington State Historical Society is digitizing all 60,000 of his images taken from the 1890s to the 1940s. And one of the things that's emerged is the variety of people that he shot. And there are a lot of pictures of ordinary Black people and well-known Black people. There's pictures of the Asian community in Seattle, Japanese, Chinese, Filipino, showing images that you've never seen before. And Ron Chen mentions in the video, he said, these pictures show not that we're just here now, but we've always been here. That this has always been an area much more diverse than the stories we tell about it, than the history we teach about it. And seeing these images are really important to getting that message that you're talking about.
Allison, have you been surprised by anything that you've learned about how Black people have actually been able to expand access to activities and areas and the outdoors?
Absolutely. One of my favorite stories that I tell is the story of this woman named Annette Diggs. She's a good friend of mine, and she's the founder of this organization called Edge Outdoors that's committed to getting women, Black women, and femme skiing.
When I walk into environments where I'm the only one, I think about the people in my community I think about the strong women in my family. I think about the legacy that the Black people went through in this nation.
And through interviewing her, I learned about this organization called the National Brotherhood of Skiers that was founded in 1972 and was committed to the work of expanding access to Black people to skiing and getting on the slopes. And this to me blew my mind because when I think about stuff that's white people stuff, skiing is number one there, right? And no doubt statistics show that skiing is still disproportionately white, like 90% plus of people who go to ski resorts are white. But we are in those spaces and we have been now for generations, right? And that is what I hope that people who are listening to this, people who watch my show, they leave with this understanding that, one, we've been there, and two, our stories matter, right? Our stories may not get told, we may not be centered, we may not be prioritized, but I don't want anybody out there to think that there's anything in this world that's only for white people.
Right. Yeah, and the stories that could be told, the stories that are out there, that's the very exciting idea.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I have a question for you, Allison. You, I believe within the last year or so, you climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. And I'm wondering if you got any sense of the outdoor culture in Africa, in that part of Africa. And did you notice a difference? And what differences did you notice? I mean, you know.
So I climbed Kilimanjaro, and I had a unique opportunity to do it with all Black women. So we were actually going for the world record of the most American-born Black women to reach the summit. We didn't get the world record. We had an incredible time. But what was very unique about that is that all of us on the trip were Black, and all of the porters, guides, everybody in our group was Black. And I will tell you that that allowed for just like a collective sigh of relief. The guides and the porters kept telling us how impactful it was for them to see American Black people, right? Because what they experience is American and European white people all the time.
Trekkers.
Right.
Yeah.
And so they said, you have no idea what it means to us to see you. And listen, they treat everybody really well, but I think that we got just an extra bump of service from them because there was this love of, you are my sister in the diaspora, and I want to show you my homeland. I will also say that as much as it is about reaching the summit, there was also just this appreciation of the experience. Like, we would climb every day, and then we were eating and hanging out, and it was as much about, everything there, communing with the mountain versus just conquering it. And that to me was a unique experience, and I'm headed back again this summer, and I want to bring people with me so that they can also experience that.
Allison and Knut, both, for all of these very important historical figures who loom so large in our stories and our history, but are problematic, who had very objectionable views. What do we do with that? What do we do with them?
We have to be comfortable with the discomfort of keeping their stories alive and looking critically at them. Honestly, history is neither good nor bad. History is a retelling of what has happened. What you're seeing happen now, particularly in this country, is that there's an agenda to remove certain stories from curriculums, to sanitize certain figures, because of this idea that people will feel guilty about their ancestors, right? But telling history is not about guilt. It's in order to inform the present so that you understand the factors, what's going on in life, and honestly, so that you don't make those same mistakes again, right? So I try to tell everybody whose ancestors have done terrible things, which is probably everybody to some degree, that it is not on your shoulders to carry that, but it is on your shoulders to look forward and make sure that doesn't happen again. How can I contribute to using my privilege, my resources, to changing that in the future?
I think Allison's exactly right. You can't change the past. It's there. It's happened. You can talk about it differently. You can explore the past and learn more about it with your curiosity. And then, yes, the only thing you can do anything about is the present. I think it's how you go forward with a sense of humbleness and grace in terms of trying to leave the world a better place than perhaps it was.
Something that I learned from my parents very young was to always question the history that I was consuming and think about whose story is being told, who's being prioritized, right? So the other piece of this is never stop being curious. Never stop looking for who is not being centered here, whose voice is not present. And that's really where you find the good stuff, I think.
Thanks for listening to Mossback. The video series is now in its 10th season. If you'd like to see all the episodes from this or any season of Mossback's Northwest, you can find them at cascadepbs.org. And that's where you'll also find the new season of Out and Back with Allison Mariella Désir. This episode of Mossback was produced by Sarah Bernard. Our story editor and executive producer is Sarah Menzies. You can subscribe to the Mossback podcast wherever you listen. And whatever platform you're listening on, please review us. We'd love to know what you think of the show. And check out the show notes if you'd like to get in touch. Also, if you'd like to support the work we do, join the members who make Mossback's Northwest possible. Your donation will help fund the Cascade PBS lineup of podcasts, the video docuseries we stream every week, and the in-depth reporting we deliver every day. In addition to supporting our journalism, members receive great member benefits, including Cascade PBS Passport, with extended access to an on-demand library of local and PBS favorites. And being a member means you can sign up for the exclusive weekly Mossback Den newsletter from Knut Berger, where he offers greater insight into his latest historical discoveries. Go to cascadepbs.org/membership to sign up today. Mossback is a product of Cascade PBS. I'm Stephen Hegg. We'll be back soon with another episode.